Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today I'm going to be talking about Dungeons & Dragons, Magic the Gathering, and the new Guilds of Ravnica book coming out, and specifically the difference between the source of magic in Magic the Gathering and the source of magic in Dungeons & Dragons, and what this means for Dungeons & Dragons settings and for the game overall. Okay, so the reason why we're talking today is the Guilds of Ravnica hardback book that is coming out for Dungeons & Dragons. It's coming out in about another week or two. I believe it's November 16th is the release. It is a huge, huge deal within Dungeons & Dragons. So essentially, you have a situation where Dungeons & Dragons is bringing Ravnica, an existing Magic the Gathering setting, into Dungeons & Dragons. That's huge. It's a really, really, really big deal, okay? In fact, to me, the overarching thing to think about is the ramifications of Ravnica. That's the grouping of what we're talking about, the ramifications of Ravnica. I think my prediction is that the overall ramifications of Ravnica is that all of the Dungeons & Dragons settings are going to be swept aside, and the Magic the Gathering settings will become, which are a collective, cohesive, singular setting, right? Will replace the patchwork setting the patchwork of tatterdemalion settings we have now for Dungeons & Dragons overall, okay? And there's a whole host of reasons for this, and just one of them is the source of magic in Dungeons & Dragons versus the source of magic in Magic the Gathering. So let's start talking about it, okay? In Dungeons & Dragons, the source of magic is bifurcated. It is split into two, okay? So, the source of magic in Dungeons & Dragons, and this is talking about across all settings, right? And that's one of the biggest problems we have is there are different sources for magic in different Magic the Gathering settings, right? In different Dungeons & Dragons settings. So, but if you look at all the settings at the macro level and say, what is the source of magic in Dungeons & Dragons? This is what it is. Dungeons & Dragons magic is bifurcated into arcane magic and divine magic. Arcane magic, the source of arcane magic is the world and the universe, okay? And it's literally that vague and generic, right? The source for divine magic, which is fundamentally different than arcane magic, and which has never been actually solved within Dungeons & Dragons. It makes no sense that the magic within Dungeons & Dragons is bifurcated, right? The source for divine magic is deities, gods, right? So it really makes very little sense overall, right? It makes very little sense that wizards are pulling magic out of the air, out of the cosmos, and a cleric is praying to a deity and getting magic from that deity, right? It's never made sense. It is and one of the reasons why is when, in my opinion, is when Gary Gygax made the magical, determined the magical source for Dungeons & Dragons in 1974, he had a very different outlook on the supernatural than he did at the end of his life. Read any book and you're going to see that Gary Gygax's opinion on the supernatural was incredibly different at the end of his life than it was in 1974, and in the 3 to 5 years leading up to that, when most of what went into Dungeons & Dragons was percolating in his mind. I think he was thinking about Dungeons & Dragons. I think the beginning of when Gygax was thinking about Dungeons & Dragons is when he was involved in a conflict by a group of in a small group of boys in Chicago, which in many ways prompted the move from Chicago to Wisconsin, from Chicago Yeah, from Illinois to Chicago. I'm sorry, from Illinois to Wisconsin. It's a broader topic, but keep moving here. All right, so right there, Dungeons & Dragons has this bifurcation in its magic, and fundamentally, its magic makes no sense, right? Now, in my opinion, you'd be okay in Dungeons & Dragons if it was either or. If all the magic was just drawn out of the world and the universe, you'd be fine. And if all the magic was drawn from deities, you'd also be fine. But the fact that it's both is, frankly, in my opinion, nonsense, right? It's not a strong base. It's really not a strong base for the source of magic in Dungeons & Dragons. What is the source of magic in Magic the Gathering, right? Well, it becomes very simple, right? And actually, not only simple, but I would even say elegant in some ways, okay? The source of magic in Magic the Gathering is land, okay? So the land itself supplies the magic. The magic is drawn from the land by planeswalkers, and they manifest that into spells. When a planeswalker draws magic from the land, they get a different type. They get magic that has been essentially filtered, right, by the land itself. So islands specifically produce magic that comes from a perspective of change and manipulation, right? Being able to manipulate the different elements of the universe, right? Time, mostly time, right? Being able to counter other magic, right? Fundamentally break apart the bonds that another spell is created with, right? So it's manipulation of the fundamental elements of the universe is blue magic, right? And that magic comes specifically from islands, right? Islands surrounded by water, right? Okay. Mountains produce a red magic, and that red magic is most easily channeled into spells which are aggressive and battle-like, okay? So, essentially, red magic is essentially battle magic, okay? White magic comes from plains, the plains themselves, okay? The sweeping plains of wheat, the sweeping plains of grass, right? Plains, large open pieces of land where the sun shines down and is uninhibited, right? These plains produce a magic of peace, right? A magic that helps people to be healed, a magic that is protective, okay? Swamps, when a planeswalker draws magic from a swamp, they get magic that is death-related, that is parasitic, right? And is used to harm, and that is also, mostly is aligned with death, okay? So, and things that make people die in slow, agonizing ways, not in an abrupt way, the way red magic would, okay? All right, and then you have green magic, which comes specifically from forests, right? And forests is the magic of growth, of verdancy, right? Of life, all right? In many ways, okay? So, and by the way, magic does not come from gods in Magic the Gathering, and in some settings where gods are mentioned, essentially the gods are simply giving magic that's being pulled from the land to planeswalkers. So the reality is the source of magic is much more straightforward, much more cohesive and consistent within Magic the Gathering than it is in Dungeons & Dragons. Now, I will say, this isn't because Gary Gygax screwed up. One of the things you have to remember with Gary Gygax is when he was creating Dungeons & Dragons, he was bringing forward an absolutely new way to play games, a new way to create art, right? And so he shattered the ceiling of creativity and artistry and intelligence that could be attached to art and that could be attached to games, right? So he accomplished enough in that. He couldn't do everything perfectly. And frankly, I'll say this, I just don't think that the magic in Dungeons & Dragons, the source of magic in Dungeons & Dragons, the bifurcation that exists within it, makes absolutely no sense. It really doesn't, right? Whereas the view of magic in Magic the Gathering is modern, it is consistent, it is far less connected to Christianity specifically, right? It's much more of a global view, right? So that people from different cultures can actually enjoy Magic the Gathering from the perspective of understanding magic much more easily than people who are coming to Dungeons & Dragons, especially who are coming from another culture. The game is also, Dungeons & Dragons is already incredibly American. Well, part of that is it's systematized, in my opinion, systematized Tolkien, and Tolkien's influences are massively Christian, right? So the magic in Dungeons & Dragons really foundationally comes from a Christian base, right? Whereas Magic the Gathering is a much more modern, globalist look at Magic the Gathering, and both Dungeons & Dragons and Magic the Gathering, both are American products, but just like Coca-Cola, just like baseball, just like comic books, they were birthed in America, they are sold globally. These are global products. So the ability to have people from any nation on the planet being able to interact with the source of your magic much more easily is a good thing overall, in my opinion. Excuse me. So basically, when you have a situation where your player character is using magic, if and when I think it's a lock. I think Ravnica is here's the other issue. It doesn't matter how well Ravnica does on the shelves for Dungeons & Dragons. I believe that Magic the Gathering settings will so basically Zendikar and Innistrad and Zendikar, Innistrad, and Dominaria are going to sweep aside Dragonlance. What else? They're going to sweep aside Dragonlance, Faerun, and Darksun. They really are. And the reason why is that, here's the thing. Ravnica's success with the player base and with Dungeon Masters absolutely does not matter, okay? It doesn't need to outsell anything, right, to be successful. And here's why. One of the strangest things that Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition proved is that the Dungeons & Dragons settings have been non-starters for 44 years. That's how old Dungeons & Dragons is. It's 44 years old. And for 44 years, Dungeons & Dragons never really created a single setting that was so compelling that it stood next to the rules of the game. The rules of Dungeons & Dragons are peerless. Nothing ever created has come close to matching what was accomplished with the rule set for Dungeons & Dragons and the innovation that is accomplished. The same absolutely cannot be said for Dungeons & Dragons settings. Dungeons & Dragons settings fall into three groupings: halt settings, dormant settings, and active settings, okay? Halt settings are settings that will never, ever, ever be forwarded again by Wizards of the Coast for multiple reasons. Dormant settings are settings that don't have fundamental problems, could be used, but are essentially duplicative of other better settings within Dungeons & Dragons. And then active settings are settings that are fundamentally sound and that people are still calling for today within Dungeons & Dragons. But here's the kicker. Not a single setting book was ever released for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. And Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition is the most successful version of the game ever, which means that you need the Dungeons & Dragons rules. In Dungeons & Dragons, you do not need a single created setting that has been created so far in Dungeons & Dragons, right? So Faerun is probably the very best setting. Forgotten Realms is the best setting, that's ever been created for Dungeons & Dragons. I don't think there's any question about that. There's just been more done, it's more cohesive, and it's better, and all it is really just a bare, it's a dry-brushed Tolkien, it's dry-brushed Middle-earth, right? And so in 44 years, the people who have worked on settings have never made a setting so strong that the game can't stand without it. Because right now, we see that Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition is standing and doing incredibly well without a single setting book, right? So why then will Magic the Gathering settings replace it? Here's why. Magic the Gathering settings, as Dungeons & Dragons settings, make massive economic sense for Wizards of the Coast. So here we go, okay? Check it. This is like revolutionary if you understand this, okay? This is huge, okay? Magic the Gathering, all right, the settings in Magic the Gathering are illustrated. They don't really come from text, right? They're created by literally every single mini set. Okay, so Magic the Gathering is one setting overall. It's one setting with a whole bunch of planes. So Zendikar, Alara, Dominaria, all these different settings for Magic the Gathering are cohesively one setting, all right? So different planes, one setting. Those settings are all illustrated. They all literally have 500 plus images showing you the creatures of that world, the people of that world, the land of that world, literally the land, like every aspect of how the land looks, right? There's literally 50 to 100 land cards in every set. And people think land cards are small. They're not. It illustrates what the world looks like, right? The artifacts of that world, what the people look like. And they're beautiful. They're done by literally some of the best fantasy artists and non-fantasy artists in the world, right? And so while Dungeons & Dragons brought forward its settings with text, the Magic the Gathering settings have been brought forward with illustrations. And this makes them fundamentally better modern settings. People don't have to read the settings of Magic the Gathering. They can see them. They can see what the weapons look like. They can see what the clothes look like. They're just so much better, right? The fact that they're illustrated, right? In addition to that, Magic Wizards of the Coast owns all those images, and they can do whatever they like with them, right? So when you go and you say, okay, Dominaria is being made into a Dungeons & Dragons setting, at minimum, you can reuse literally hundreds of pieces of art that many Dungeons & Dragons players have never seen that are better than anything that's ever been in any Dungeons & Dragons book, right? The art on Magic the Gathering is absolutely peerless. There's never been a project like it. There's no project in the world that has 40 or 50,000 pieces of fantasy art, right? So Dungeons & Dragons can't even touch it, right? It's arguable that there are probably more pieces of art done in a 3-year span of Magic the Gathering's lifetime than in every single Dungeons & Dragons product ever done, right? They've used art in a way that Dungeons & Dragons only dreamed of, okay? And again, that is just much easier to bring people in. So even if they just reuse a lot of the art that they've already used in Magic the Gathering, which will be brand new for most Dungeons & Dragons players, right? One of the things that will happen, in addition to that, is even if you're not having a situation where you're just reposting the same pieces, when you say, hey, give me a picture of Liliana for this Dungeons & Dragons book, that person doesn't need to create Liliana. She's already set, so there's already storyboards for it. The art for Dungeons & Dragons can be made much, much, much faster. Much faster, okay? And much more cheaply, and it can be made much more consistently, right? So there's just so many benefits of monetarily, right? Where they're going to be able to make Dungeons & Dragons products faster. They're going to be able to make Dungeons & Dragons products much more easily by switching the settings over to Magic the Gathering settings. Now, I want to be clear. I don't think overall that the Magic the Gathering settings are better than, I don't know. It is arguable. I don't know. I think the jury's, you know what? I do think the Magic the Gathering settings are slightly better than Dungeons & Dragons and the Dungeons & Dragons settings. And one of the reasons why is the Magic the Gathering settings are much, much, much more cohesive than the Dungeons & Dragons settings. The history of Dungeons & Dragons settings over 44 years is just a tatterdemalion mishmash, right? Where the history of settings from 1993 till now, right, for Magic the Gathering is just far more cohesive, right? So, and the reality is, you know, nobody really understood in Dungeons & Dragons that they were on a clock and that somebody had to make a compelling, a super compelling, setting for Dungeons & Dragons. And I think the issue is there have been over 20 settings for Dungeons & Dragons. Arguably, there should have never been more than 7 max, right? Because many of them are duplicative. Many of them are throwaway. They can't even be used going forward, right? And then some of them are good, okay? But here's the issue. I'm not sure there's a single setting for Dungeons & Dragons. I will say it. I don't think there's a single setting that for Dungeons & Dragons that is good, that is great. I think there are many that are good. I don't think there's a single one that is great. And that's the issue. Magic the Gathering is going to sweep in with its cohesiveness and with its art base, and it's going to sweep aside everything that exists for Dungeons & Dragons, in my opinion. This is my prediction. I believe the ramifications of Ravnica are a sweep aside of every existing Dungeons & Dragons setting, and that 20 years from now, when people say Dungeons & Dragons, the character they will know most as a Dungeons & Dragons character will not be Drizzt Dourden. It will be Jace, right? Jace Beleren. So that's what I'm saying. I'm saying that Magic the Gathering will absolutely become the default setting for Dungeons & Dragons. It will replace Forgotten Realms. It will replace every single Dungeons & Dragons setting. And it makes a ton of sense economically from the perspective of for Wizards of the Coast. It makes so much economic sense. So that's my take. And so overall, I think Magic the Gathering has the most fundamental issue why it should be taken over is it has a much better understanding of Magic. It has a much better it has a much better platform for Magic, source of Magic in Magic the Gathering than it does in Dungeons & Dragons. And the other thing is they won't fit. You can't, like, Ravnica does not just slide in next to Forgotten Realms. It will be fighting to be the default setting of Dungeons & Dragons. And once it becomes the default setting of Dungeons & Dragons, Ravnica is not just another plane. It's a universe that's been attached to Dungeons & Dragons. And there absolutely is not room. There is not room, right? And I'll tell you right now, I'll bet you there on this planet right now, there are more people who know who Chandra is than Elminster, without a doubt, right? And that's been done since 1993, whereas Dungeons & Dragons had since 1974 to get this done right, and it just never happened. So I thoroughly predict that the Magic Gathering settings will become the default settings for Dungeons & Dragons, purely for economic reasons. Whatever the players and the Dungeon Masters think about it, it won't matter. And the Dungeon Masters and players have already signed off on this. They bought 5th edition like candy, and 5th edition never had a single setting book. So the Dungeon Masters and the players have already said, with their actions, not with their mouths, that they've never been compelled by any of the Dungeons & Dragons settings in a major way. And so you can just sweep them all aside and use Magic the Gathering, which will help Wizards of the Coast tremendously. All right, that's my take. I'm curious what you think. Thank you, and have a good day, and please consider liking and subscribing.